And Peter, I wanted to come to you on this as well, because when we talk about opening things up, theatres are one of the sectors that it seems like it's going to be one of the last sectors of the economy to open back up. Clearly, there are problems with social distancing within theatres, and then obviously it becomes uneconomical for theatres to run if they're only able to have 25% capacity. How are you and people that you know in the theatre business coping at the moment, and how big of a threat is this to the industry as a whole?
To answer the first question first, it's very much a mixed picture, just as it was beforehand. So for someone like me, I'm a playwright, therefore my working life is scheduled about a year and a half ahead of what's going on. So therefore, I'm writing a play at the moment. I'm doing an adaptation as it happens, which is good, because original creativity is quite beyond me. But the idea of adapting a novel for the stage, but I do have the uneasy feeling in the back of my head that I'm adapting it for a stage I can't quite imagine. I can't quite, I can't see it the way I usually can. I can't make the same assumptions that I could beforehand. But for people who are not as lucky as I am, and for people who are not lucky enough to make 50% plus of their earnings from self-employment, and therefore that government scheme applies to me. A lot of people working in the theatre work casually. They don't hit that 50%. They are seeing their whole lives disappear like smoke. I mean, there are people I know who are already in very serious financial difficulty, and because they're not conventionally employed, or conventionally self-employed. They fall between stools. And it's very difficult, and the benefit system has never been good at coping with the creative lifestyle, shall we say? And the tax system and bank managers find it equally incomprehensible that you can earn absolutely nothing and then suddenly 6,000 quid. It's a very odd way to live. And the virus is, in a sense, accentuating everything that was odd and difficult and mixed about it. We have, a difference between here and the UK is that there doesn't seem to be any fixed policy in the UK for even attempting to deal with the enormous complexities of the economics of producing theatre that is locked down. But whereas in Scotland, there has, at least on Friday, just there was a very welcome. There was £10 million, and not an inconsiderable amount of money in governmental terms, not a lot, but still that amount of money was put into the major theatre buildings and establishments as an emergency payment, as basically this will get us through and avoid people being permanently laid off and theatre companies being closed, because it's very difficult to reopen them if they're completely closed, until March. It's very specifically till March. I don't know any of the details. I suspect the March date is because that's the end of the financial year, I suspect.
Now, one of the main reasons that we have Adam here with us today is because we are marking this weekend the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide. We had a special show discussing this on Friday night. Also, back in January, we spoke to Hassan Hassanovic, who was a survivor of the genocide, someone who lost most of his family. He now works in Remembrance. He works at the genocide centre there in Srebrenica. Adam, if I could come to you first on this. You worked for a long time in Srebrenica, helping to identify the bodies of the nearly 8,000 victims. Tell us a bit about how you're feeling today on the 25th anniversary of the genocide.
Well, Kenny, it's a mixed I suppose the mixed emotions. Sometimes the overwhelming loss of life is so awe-inspiring that it's hard to take in. I think also the horror of what happened, the terrible efforts to cover up the crimes that happened, and the sort of extensive range of denial is quite disheartening. However, I suppose the work that I was involved in, the organisation that I belong to, the International Commission on Missing Persons, it did something quite unprecedented, which was to recover and find and identify those missing people through a process that forced governments to take account for what happened and for the responsibilities they had for the family. So I suppose mixed with that is a sense of pride in what's happened after the event, with almost 90% of the victims being found and recovered throughout the country.
Maree, your name actually came up during the show. The very Reverend Lorna Hood, who runs Remembering Srebrenica Scotland. She mentioned that you had been someone who had come on a delegation with her and had become a very powerful advocate for the issue back then. How are you feeling today, and what are your thoughts on the anniversary?
So I would say, like Adam, I've got very mixed emotions. I'm absolutely indebted to the charity Remembering Srebrenica Scotland, who took me out as part of the delegation. They regularly take groups of leaders with all sorts of roles, politicians, educators, out to Srebrenica to bear witness to the genocide. As Adam mentioned, there is still an element of denial, which is, really disturbing. So first and foremost, we bear witness, and secondly, to try and learn lessons. And sounds really glib, frankly. I'm a year on from my visit. I'm still processing what I learned about what happened there. It's not easy to learn any easy lessons, although I know, everybody says it, and it's commonly said because it's absolutely vital that we learn lessons from these episodes in history. But it is devastating to see the impact. It's devastating. As Minister for Children and Young People, I spoke to adults who were children at the time, and to hear the legacy of the impact of those events is disturbing. Simply the hunger. If you think back to Sarajevo, the siege of Sarajevo, people were hungry then, and the impact on your physical development, if you experience hunger at a very early day, is a very early stage of your life, is devastating. So never mind the emotional impact of an ethnic genocide, of a genocide and a war. The simple fact of the level of insecurity and hunger has an impact. So it had a profound effect on me. And yesterday being the 25th anniversary, one of the things I am always struck by is that this had a lifetime in Europe. I'm 47 years old. I was in my late teens, early 20s when this war began. I was living in Truden in my pre-reg year when the genocide happened. And I just, the contrast between my life and the people who were living through it now. I watched there's a museum of war childhood in Sarajevo, which is one of the best museums I've ever been to. And they were telling the stories of all the people who had lived through it. And I thought, these people are all younger than me. They were children at the time that it happened. And it is just an incredible insight. And, 25 years in the snap of, blink of an eye, it's gone by.
But we move on now to some statistics that were published this week, showing that more than 900,000 children have lost access to vital financial support since April 2017. and 900 women have been forced to disclose that their third child was conceived as a result of rape in order to access tax credits and other support. This is something that, Alison, I know you were one of the first people to highlight this rape clause. How do you feel when you hear that 900 women have been put in this position? Alison? Oh, we seem to have lost Alison. Oh no, we've got you. Sorry.
We're back.
We've got you now. Yeah,
Thank
sorry.
you. Just that it absolutely chills me to the bone that 900 women have had to fill in this form to see that their third child has been born as the result of rape. That they have had to put that on record and prove that to officialdom in order to put food on the table. And I should say as well as having to fill in that form, a part of the condition of that is that they're not living with the parent of that child as well, which again can put women in a very difficult position if they are forced to then leave a household to, where they're experiencing domestic abuse, coercive control, because at that point of leaving can be amongst the most dangerous situations for women who are experiencing this, and their children as well. So that the government knowingly puts women through this, that there are now 900 women across the UK that have filled in this form, it is really worrying. It's really disturbing, and it hasn't got any less disturbing for me over the course of this. And what coronavirus has really exposed is the weaknesses in the welfare state. There are now tens of thousands more people claiming universal credit than would ever have claimed it before. And the system is not set up to support people in the way that they ought to be supported. It's no longer a welfare net, a social security safety net. It's absolutely full of holes, and people are not being supported as a result of policies like the two-child limit.
And Kirstein, as a member of the Women's Equality Party, obviously women's rights are right at the top of your agenda. Why do you think this has been pushed through and put into practice, even when it clearly traumatizes these 900 or however many more women have had to, at least make a decision about what they were going to disclose? Why do you think the government is so deaf to the needs of women?
The rape clause is a classic example of why the Women's Equality Party was founded and why I joined it, because it's an example of a policy that was made. It was linked to policies on tax credits and universal credit, which in themselves were deeply ideologically flawed. And the two-child limit was deeply ideologically flawed. And then somebody somewhere in a committee went, oh no, but what if the third child is as a result of rape? God knows how that even got on the agenda. But instead of saying, this policy is inherently anti-women and anti-children, and is deeply ideologically flawed, they went, well, what can we do to tinker with it? Because we are actually committed to the policy. We are committed to the ideology behind the policy that says the state will not support you. And as Alison said, COVID-19 has absolutely revealed the fundamental lack of support, the systematic support that is available and suitable for people in times of crisis. And so they had gone down, and in political science we call this path dependency. You've gone so far down the route of this policy that you can't backtrack and say, oh no, we were wrong. So they end up tinkering with it and making the whole thing worse than it was in the beginning. And the reason that happens is because we don't have a feminist ideology, an ideology that says, let's look at how policies impact on women and families as the core of our policy making. We just simply do not have that in any system of legislation in this country, in any political party in this country. And this is exactly why the Women's Equality Party was founded, because this is how policy gets made. It gets made on an ideological basis that deeply harms women, and then when that is revealed, there is no sensible heads around the table that says this is wrong. They just carry on with deeply, deeply aggressive, harmful policies. I mean, universal credit in and of itself is a deeply harmful policy. We are seeing the way in which it absolutely is not suitable for lone parents, it's not suitable for people with disabilities, it's not suitable for all of the families that are struggling the most under COVID-19. We're not all in this together. This is hitting families in poverty, this is hitting women, this is hitting children particularly hard, particularly children in poverty. You know, you talked about the huge rise of children in poverty since 2017, the huge rise in children who would have to, you know, who are not actually gaining access to basic food. Use of food banks, the rise in numbers of children claiming free school meals, the rise in numbers of children going hungry because they can't get access to those free school meals while the schools are in lockdown. This is absolutely horrifying that this is happening in a wealthy nation. And so just to come back to your original question, which is how has this happened? This has happened because we do not have the right values and principles at the heart of our government.
Andrew, another development we've seen this week was George Galloway launching his Alliance for Unity. This is the kind of flip side of the discussion that's been going on in the independence movement for a while about a list party to kind of unify the vote. You mentioned older white men kind of telling people how to think. Is George Galloway and this list party the way to go, do you think?
I think as unionism continues to shrink and continues to lose support in Scotland, we'll see a number of people who have made careers from the union attempt to shore up support and attempt to protect their income streams. I'm pretty confident that Mr. Galloway nowadays is really only interested in Mr. Galloway. I really don't believe that he's particularly bothered about anything else. I think this list party or this list organisation that he's been setting up, I think the behaviour that I've seen so far from that group probably gives the lie where they're going to go with this. An organisation which uses an RAF roundel military insignia as its logo, an organisation which has already started its activities by blocking widely journalists and others who are asking sensible and coherent questions, attempting to understand what it is that this group wants to do. So an aggressive, a passive-aggressive behaviour on Twitter and an overtly aggressive branding and look and feel tells us that this also feels like the kind of end of the story for unionism. As these I would like to think are the indications of the death throes of the cause.
A group of people who appear to have lost the heat this week are the Scottish Tory party. Jackson Carlaw quit very suddenly. I don't think anybody was expecting that, perhaps not even Jackson Carlaw. And already we seem to be preparing for the coronation of Douglas Ross. So, Linda, coming to you first on this one. Why do you think Jackson Carlaw resigned? Was he really as bad as some people have tried to make out?
Well, you know, I was there on Thursday when we had the First Minister's statement and Jackson Carlaw's response, and he was pretty grim, pretty awful. I thought he was humiliated, but I was still really shocked. By the time I got home and had a look, he'd resigned, so it was a bit of a shocker. Why has he resigned? Well, we have seen all the reports of being told to go, and it's all very, very strange. I've tried to look at it from a different angle. I mean, I think back to when Jackson Carlaw first started speaking about coronavirus and the measures we were taking. He was very, very supportive of our First Minister, and I know she appreciated that because she said so many times. I remember that Jackson was pro-Europe and disappointed at the Brexit scenario. I would like to think that Jackson Carlaw is a fairly decent man who just found it too difficult to keep speaking against his principles, and that this started to show in his performance. So I think there's a bit of, yes, he's been told to go, But I also think there's a bit of that's as a result of him not being as on message as perhaps people thought he should be in his own party. But I'm really puzzled about what's happening, because literally within minutes of Jackson Cllr resigning, we're suddenly told that the heir apparent is Douglas Ross and that Ruth Davidson's going to be running the show in Holyrood. And I'm thinking, yeah, wait a minute, they've got 2 deputies sitting in Holyrood. They've got Annie Wells and they've got Liam Kerr. How do they feel about that? Because basically what's being said is you guys are pretty rubbish and you're not capable of any of this, and we have to bring in some saviour from Westminster.
Yeah.
You know, who chose to leave Holyrood and go down to Westminster. So it's all very, very strange.
I'm going to come to almost all of those points. But Lizzie, obviously you're not in the Parliament, you're not quite as close to this. How has the way the Tories have acted in the last few days come across to you?
So you're going to say in the last years. To be honest, although I'm a very political animal and active as an activist, I hate parliamentary politics. I really, really don't like it. So I look at what the Tories are doing and I don't pay much attention because I'm not interested in parliamentary politics, but more specifically, when it involves the Conservatives, particularly the Scottish Conservatives, I can't really register much interest apart from this day.
Europe's last dictator, the leader of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, is facing election today. Now, he's been in power for 25 years, and in theory he has had election wins before. But as Stalin reportedly said, it's not necessarily who votes, it's who counts the votes. So, Craig, what do you think the chances are of these women who have kind of taken up the baton against Lukashenko? What do you think the chances are of them actually achieving victory today?
I would say probably it would be a bigger news story if they win than if they don't win. Belarus, I can't pretend to be an expert in what's going on the ground right now there, but it is quite interesting that Belarus has a constitution that in theory is very liberal and very open and should be able to facilitate this kind of election in a free and fair way. But the practice on the ground in the country is that the constitutional ideals are not upheld. That's maybe a warning to us in Scotland, where we had fascinating discussions about the constitution of an independent Scotland. You know, a constitution is a powerful and valuable thing, but it is only as powerful as a country's willingness to uphold it.
Yeah. And Effie, if I could come to you just quite quickly on this. These women have kind of taken up the charge after their husbands, who were also activists, have been jailed or silenced or kind of taken out of the equation. How important is it for these kind of challenges to great dictatorial power? How important is it that women are able to take a lead in these things?
Huge. Women have done miracles. As we know, we are particularly empowered in being able to negotiate our way out of dire situations. But also the other thing that has happened, and this is a direct result of patriarchal systems, is that women have also facilitated misogyny and authoritarian rule by siding and ingratiating themselves with the wrong groups. Women have given us the vote, universal suffrage. Women have, done amazing things, both in science and in the humanities. So we can. Now, politically, this is an interesting question, Kenny, because politically, women can form and have been known to form very powerful groups and almost reinvent ideology from a different perspective. from a different perspective in regards to the materialist cultures that we've all been born into. It's the idea that they will group together and do what they're doing at the moment. I think it's of huge political significance. And I would like to see, obviously, as Craig said, it would be impressive, and I think unlikely that today there will be a win. But simply in making that statement and coming together, that in itself is a huge, big victory.
This week we saw a YouGov poll showing support for independence at 53%. This is a record high in a YouGov poll, very close to the 54% that we've seen in a couple of other polls already this year. So Maggie, in your role as convener of the Scottish Independence Convention, is this the product of all your hard work, or is something else going on?
Oh, Kenny, I would love to claim credit for this, but firstly, that's not my style. And also, I don't think we can see this kind of shift as down to any one organisation or one individual, with the possible exception of the UK Prime Minister. I think the way in which the British government has handled quite a lot of things over the last few months has contributed to that significantly. But I think it's always been my goal, and the thing with the movement, the independence movement, that I'm interested in is building the social movement so that independence becomes inevitable.
But Alan, from London, obviously, this probably looks a little bit different. What's been your perspective on seeing this rise in support, this now apparent majority support for independence?
I don't believe this. You've scored a 5 out of 5. As I'm listening to this, my memory is going back nearly half a century to a young lady called Margot MacDonald and me, a student in Edinburgh, watching that great by-election win in 1973 that really started to waken up thinking. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the law professor in Edinburgh who basically gave the intellectual argument for Scottish independence. As a scientist, I understand our energy independence. I've just talked earlier about these two great, magnificently run and managed nuclear power stations we have, giving baseload to Scotland. As a young Boy Scout in Edinburgh, I used to go across to Denmark and see this small country of 5 million just get on with it. So the argument's easy one for me, and my perspective is, why don't make life easier for England and those people down here in London, or my friends in London. Scotland wants its independence. And by the way, as an academic, I've always been prepared to say at the turnaround, I love this situation we're hearing about in Scotland, that when the facts change, of course it's honourable to rethink and maybe change your mind. And for the Scottish people, it's unarguable. The whole political environment, the facts have changed with Brexit. So I just don't get any argument that the Scottish people don't have the right to come round again and review the political situation they find themselves in.
Sandra, is it wrong of us to refer to Baroness Davidson as Baroness Davidson?
Absolutely not. I think the more you call Ruth Davidson Baroness Davidson, and reminder that is going to be her position, is a good thing. People should know exactly what's going on. I mean, the House of Lords should be abolished anyway. You can be there for life. It's unbelievable. It's the second largest legislator in the world, bigger than the EU. It's the second largest legislator in the world, bigger than the European Parliament. So I'll certainly be calling Ruth Davidson Baroness Davidson whenever I get the opportunity in the Scottish Parliament. If you don't want to be called it, you shouldn't have took the position, the title. Simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Ellen, what about you? Do you think it's unfair to call her by her title when she just wants to be just ordinary wee Ruth, everybody's pal?
Oh, clearly she doesn't want to be that. It's just the role that she's decided to take on. I can understand why it's really uncomfortable. This independence thing is much more about class and the divisions between working class and middle class and upper class sort of lifestyles. And a baroness just doesn't sound all that working class or middle class. I'm sorry. No, I will be referring to her as Baroness myself too, and I think it's important that we start this as a matter of consequence.
Our top story today is a story that Boris Johnson is allegedly looking to break human rights law. He wants to withdraw the UK from the ECHR or alter the Human Rights Act here in the UK. Now, I'll come to you first on this, Philippa. This was something that Theresa May talked about at some length, the problem of not being able to deport criminals, not being able to get rid of the people that we want to get rid of. What do you make of this kind of story coming out that Boris Johnson is now seriously considering the same thing?
Well, it's clear the Conservatives have had their eye on human rights law and the European Convention of Human Rights for quite some time. They've used Brexit to kind of muddle it up as if somehow this is related to Brexit or related to the EU. But of course, the Convention on Human Rights predates the EU by quite some decades and came out of the Second World War. I mean, Boris Johnson's big hero, Churchill, was involved in moving towards having this kind of protection. And the simple aspect where it does affect Brexit is one of the good things, one of the many good things that we had from the EU were things like the European arrest warrant, the sharing of data and information around terrorism, around policing. And, if a policeman arrested someone for something minor, they could check immediately if they were wanted in any other European country, perhaps for, a violent crime or abuse, etc., and they would know that straight away. If we're excluded from this, then what you're talking about is you have to go away and check and ask for information. It can take ages. You have to go through extradition. So one of the things the UK wants to keep are some of these security and policing benefits. But the EU will not countenance that if the UK becomes a country that is outside the protection of human rights law, because they simply will not allow that their citizens could be arrested or extradited to a country that doesn't uphold these principles. And it's a bit like international law. If you want to break it when it suits you, it won't be there to protect you when you need it.
Mm-hmm. And Simon, this kind of constant drumbeat of the last few years that human rights law was somehow interfering with British sovereignty, it is quite disturbing, isn't it? I mean, if we saw this in certain other countries, governments saying we don't intend to keep our international treaties, we don't intend to respect human rights law, we'd look at it very differently than we do when it's our own, don't we?
This is a classic case of the government cherry picking the want of any relationship with Europe. And as Philippa was pointing out, the European arrest warrants, like Theresa May as a former Home Secretary realised the importance of that. But the Human Rights Act is brought in 1998 by Tony Blair. But every law that's passed at Westminster and at the Scottish Holyrood has to comply with the Human Rights Act. And it's such fundamental issues such as torture, torture of any form. And I think it's also particularly important that we are, as the United Kingdom, we do not have a written constitution. And things like the Human Rights Act protects the fundamental rights of citizens. It's very important to hold on to that. And it's also another red herring that the Tories always go on about sovereignty, and that the UK courts, when it comes down to it, are sovereign. You go to appeal, you shift, you can European courts. There's a fundamental issue, the Cllr law in 2010-11, establishing people's right to lawyer. So when you're arrested by the police, which people weren't aware of, that went to the European court. But people don't realise how fundamentally important is to our rights as citizens, and the way that Tories are to cast this aside. Also, when it comes to intelligence, between today, the cooperation between European countries, especially terror threats, etc., you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. It's also it's another thing that Tories use when it comes to migration, and this was used very much during the Brexit vote, and so many people did vote for Brexit. They were wanting to keep out migrants who had nothing to do with the EU. And fundamentally, this is another myth that the media doesn't clear up enough. Britain has control of immigration. The major sources of immigration we have strict control over.
Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Tories, was speaking to a fringe event at the online Tory conference that's taking place. And he said that the attitude of his party in London was making the case for independence. He said that there were too many Tories at Westminster who wanted to see the UK government focused on England, and that the union had been seen as an afterthought by successive governments. Owen, is Douglas Ross finally seeing what more than half of Scots have now seen, that Westminster isn't doing a lot for Scotland?
It's slightly bizarre to hear him saying this. I mean, I don't disagree with him, and it's not possibly the first time I found myself in a position of saying that. It's interesting he's actually recognised it, but it's just bizarre that having recognised that he is still happy to be the leader of a party in Scotland, which he himself recognises as a party do not want to effectively have anything to do with Scotland or what's going on in Scotland. I mean, we see that, again, the internal market bill is just shining a light on the fact that we have a Tory government in London who want to grab all control of decision making across the whole of the UK. They don't care about elections that are taking place. They don't care about democracy to a large extent. And they're simply just creating new laws that gives them the ability to completely overrule the devolution settlement that so many of us voted for and across the political spectrum, and that we want to see working just now until we can take it forward, becoming a fully independent parliament. But the Tories are doing everything they can to try and undermine that, which I think will only go even further to strengthen the case for independence beyond where it even already is now. And obviously, if Douglas Ross wants to actually think about what he himself has said, it can only be a matter of time till he's now then persuaded of the arguments for independence.
Well, it's interesting to see you quite that optimistic, Owen, but I'll come to Valentina now. Valentina, when you hear this kind of thing, do you think it's what do you think is behind that? Do you think do you think Douglas Ross is right that there's just a lack of interest in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, or do you think there's something else going on?
I will say that of a fringe event in a Tory conference, he must have been in a fringe event in Edinburgh, because it's hilarious that he's just realizing that now. I think that the Tory government decisions they've been making that has bringing so much austerity and has been has caused a lot of damage to Scotland and to Holyrood. It should be enough evidence that the Tories have never cared about Scotland except to benefit from it. Basically, Ross is just realizing they put him in a place to get rid of him. They were like, oh yeah, who can fit that place? Someone they would about. So they just send him there to make some time. Hopefully he won't do worse than in the general election the Scottish Tories did, because that was a catastrophe for them. And those results should give him a sense of little the Tories care about Scottish Tories.
One of the things that's been discussed a lot in Scotland is the difference in the style of messaging between Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish government versus Boris Johnson and the UK government. The First Minister obviously has been out every day explaining her decisions, taking responsibility for the situation in Scotland. We've not seen that from the UK government. I wonder, has there been the same kind of contrast in Wales?
I think it's a little bit like I'm being highly supportive of Welsh government, but I think at this time it is, as Marion was saying, actually what we do and how we talk about this really matters. It will affect how people respond. Mark Drakeford, of course, has gone about this. Mark Drakeford is the First Minister of Wales in a completely different way to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson putting out government initiatives, government announcements through his favoured press sources. Now, for us in Wales, of course, this is quite a problem because we don't have the same national press, national media that you have in Scotland. Now, I know that my SNP colleagues will have a definite opinion about certain providers of media in Scotland, but the simple truth is that people in Scotland hear Scotland being discussed and are used to going to Scottish media far more than people are in Wales. We've only got 2 daily papers. One of them is effectively a local paper. And the BBC, at times at the beginning of the emergency, actually dropped some of its bulletins. Now, although Mark Drakeford has been endeavouring to get information out, I really suspect that actually the difficulty in getting messages through and the conflicting messages, the competition between hearing what's coming through from England has actually affected some of what Welsh Government feel that they can do meaningfully, which is a pretty appalling situation to be in. And I hope that as we move ahead, that looking at, nation of Wales, our Parliament, if we can't carry out certain actions because we can't get those messages through, we need to think about how we can actually ensure that the media works to best effect for us. But no, that's been an ongoing question. And one of the things that one of my roles in Westminster is just to remind Boris Johnson sometimes that he's actually talking as the Prime Minister for England on all health matters, and to make sure that the message is conveyed clearly, because there are real differences according to different needs of different nations.
This week we heard that the BBC in Scotland is making a host of redundancies. Several very well-known journalists all being let go. So Greg, if I can come to you quickly on this. Whatever we might think of the BBC, it's not good to see so many really experienced and some very skilled journalists all being let go like this, is it?
No, it's not. And I think if we're a decent society, we should care about people who are going through difficult times, no matter what they do, where they're from, what their background is. And in the case of BBC journalists, in many parts of politics in Scotland, they're roundly condemned because of what seems to be a political line that they're taken. You know what? They're employees. They're given a job to do. They're often told this is the line that is going to be taken, and to follow it. You could say, but what they should do is just chuck it. They should just go elsewhere and work on something else. Well, they've got families and homes to maintain. They have to make a living and have a bit of consideration for them. So there are many journalists who will make statements which many of us wouldn't like to hear them make, but actually who are personally quite sympathetic to the views that a lot of us share. So let's be aware of that. Circumstances might change in the future. When the British Broadcasting Corporation becomes a Scottish Broadcasting Corporation or something of the sort, I think we'll see. Although I seem to remember there's something called Broadcasting Scotland that's got at least a partial copyright on that name. But circumstances just might change. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I do feel a high degree of sympathy for them, and if part of the reason for cuts in the BBC is because certain of their output isn't getting great coverage, and therefore they feel that they just have to nip that in the bud, maybe they should have a wee good look at themselves to see why are people not watching it, and maybe it's just the quality and the content that they're putting out. There's plenty of stuff that, you know how I start my day? Watching the news. I turn to Euronews, and then I turn to CNN, and then I possibly nip onto the BBC and Sky, but that's primarily for the weather report, and that's about it. Personally, I don't really have that much trust in the BBC News, but I have a lot of sympathy for the journalists. Okay?
Yeah, no, that's great. And all those journalists, if they do want to keep themselves busy, we can put them to work here at Broadcasting Scotland. Joyce, if I come to you on this, what do you think it says about the BBC just now that, again, we're looking at an election next year, potentially an independence referendum very soon, and yet the BBC is letting go of some of its most experienced journalists who then won't be available to cover these big events? What do you think that says about the BBC's strategy, I guess?
I think there's two things to be said about the BBC. One is that BBC News is not the whole of the BBC, and even people who are very exasperated with the BBC's current news coverage, and rightly. I mean, a lot of it is just sloppy. It's just recycling government press releases. It never checks its own perspective. I mean, I could just go on and on about the editorial faults in current BBC News, both at Scottish and UK level. But the other thing to say about the BBC, of course, is that the news is only one small part of it. And, even people who are so exasperated with that would be, quite at a loss without some of the great things that the BBC still produces. I mean, I listen to the BBC World Service in the middle of the night, and although there is some rubbish there's also some fantastic reporting from their network of international correspondents that you still wouldn't really hear anybody anywhere else. I mean, I've got a lot of time for Sky News, actually, because I think they have some very good journalists and sometimes do some very good social reporting of a kind the BBC is a bit slow about these days. But I mean, there is still tremendous stuff on the BBC. But news-wise, I think the whole thing, I mean, I was talking about courage in relation to Jacinda Ardern, and I think the whole organisation, since the Greg Dyke debacle, more than a decade and a half ago, has just totally lost its bottle in terms of news. They just don't speak truth to power in their main sort of news output. They don't challenge the sort of prevailing conservative with a small c outlook. Their attitude to the independence debate is definitely questionable. They're still talking about Scottish independence as if it was an insurgent idea when it's actually been dominant in Scottish politics for well over a decade now. They're just absolutely lacking in the kind of courage that good journalism requires. I mean, I can't remember who it was who said that famous quote about good journalism always being about publishing something that somebody doesn't want to see published. And, good journalism cannot be impartial between the powerful and the powerless. It can't. It has to stand with the powerless and give the relatively powerless a voice. And until the BBC News gets its head back round that idea, it's going to be in a permanent spiral of decline. And it's a tragedy, because for all the wee initiatives that go on in journalism, nowadays, the fact is that it's still the big organisations that can afford to actually pay people to do journalism and to make careers in journalism. And there is no better career if you can find anyone who's willing to pay you even a living wage to do it. But getting that living wage is becoming harder and harder for young journalists. And it's absolutely essential to a free and functioning society that we find ways of doing that. And through the NUJ, with my branch, Edinburgh Freelance Branch, we've been doing a lot of work on that during lockdown. And there's actually a great deal of response to that from politicians of all parties. And people realise that journalism is essential, but hammering out the details of what you can actually do to protect it and to protect people's ability to work in it else, and very difficult. But we're working on that.
Someone for whom things are moving in the very wrong direction is Donald Trump. So Donald Trump was silenced this week. His microphone, as was Joe Biden's, was muted so that he would behave himself in the second and the last presidential debate. Unfortunately, it's made people say Donald Trump sounded almost presidential because he wasn't allowed to say anything. Go figure that one. But it's become evident in the last few days that two of the pillars of his previous success, people over 65 and suburban women, often known rather derogatorily as hockey moms, are deserting him at a real pace. So I'm delighted that women might be the reason for his demise, although horrified, frankly, that so many women found that they could vote for him in the first place. So, what are you making of the last couple of weeks of the race for the White House? Michelle, are you engaged with it?
I think that it's interesting, but I think it's difficult because I'm a political geek, so
So this is going to be interesting to me. However, I do know some people in America, people who've lived in Scotland that now live over there. And I remember engaging them a couple of years ago about this, saying, where do you think things are going to go? And at that point in time, there wasn't that much confidence that things would change from Trump, because although he himself is horrific, in terms of day-to-day life, everyone was feeling some level of benefit from their community, because a lot of them were getting tax breaks, for example. And if someone has more money in their pocket, then they're going to have that feeling of, well, then I'll just put up with that. But this is where this year's been very interesting. COVID-19 has been a real undoing of Trump, because it's shown how poor his leadership is. I think if you've been really into politics, you'd be screaming from the hilltop that you're not surprised to see this, because we know how horrific he is. However, people on a day-to-day basis have been impacted by the very poor decision-making that he's been making. And Trump has been asked the right challenging questions from Biden. I know that there are some questions about whether Biden is the best person, on that other side of the coin. However, I think, having had those conversations of recent time, that discussion has now changed, and there is a real push and feeling for Biden. There are questions, obviously, around the way Trump could potentially, will he accept the result, the gerrymandering that can take place. There's a whole host of other issues that need to be considered here. But in terms of the feeling on the ground, I think that there's been an earthquake and people are now moving towards Biden.
We are still, of course, looking at the potential for a no-deal Brexit come the end of December. And Anthony, obviously studying Europe is your whole business. I wonder, first of all, do you feel that there is going to be some sort of deal thrashed out before time runs out?
Yes. On balance, I think it is probable that there will be an agreement. But as we know, this will be a thin agreement. It will be a relatively, at most, it will be a relatively basic free trade agreement, and there may be some additional elements of cooperation on data, security, criminal justice, and so on. But none of that is guaranteed. Time is extremely short. And, as we know, this is really up to the UK government, and of course reflects the way in which the UK government has conducted the Brexit process throughout. On the one hand, they say, well, it's important to negotiate tough and to leave things at the last minute. That's what always happens in negotiations and trade negotiations. That may be the case, but Brexit is completely different. This is not about striking a trade deal with an entity that we have no relationship with. This is about ensuring that we don't lose any more than what we've already lost in terms of connectivity with the European Union. So it's vitally crucial to Scotland's prosperity and to the wider UK's prosperity that there is a deal. And for the UK government to rock up and pretend that, it would be nice to have an agreement if the EU compromises, but we'll be fine without one, is a blatant lie. And it's very frustrating to see a UK government take that approach. But of course, Westminster politics have been completely overtaken by Brexit populism. So it's nothing new. But the cavalier nature in which Boris Johnson is seemingly content with the prospect of a no-deal Brexit is extremely alarming. And there's only so much
hear
you can do in
the Westminster government saying things like, we're quite happy with no deal, we're focusing on an Australia-style deal. When you hear those kind of things, do you believe them? Do you think that Boris Johnson and his closer advisors actually would be satisfied with no deal, or do you think that is just bluff?
It's very difficult to say. I think that I believe that politically speaking, I think that Boris Johnson and his government would like to have a deal. In terms of personally speaking, I imagine that they wouldn't really be affected one way or the other because they were well off before, and presumably they'll be well off afterwards. This is about everyone else. This is about the country, of Scotland and the state of the UK in general, and of ordinary people. Those are the people who will be most impacted by no-deal Brexit. People who are already rich will probably still be rich, regardless of what happens. So, I think politically speaking, it looks better to have a deal. So I presume that's what they're going for privately. But, again, from that was I was speaking about earlier about thinking of a longer term horizon. The political calculations of Westminster are always about the next day or the next week. The UK and the EU need a relationship. They need a close relationship, and we will continue to need a close relationship forever, at least for the next few decades. So to sour relations with the EU as the UK has done throughout the Brexit process. I mean, from the very beginning, throughout the withdrawal negotiations, through these current negotiations on the future relationship, that makes it so difficult to have a positive future relationship. And we need that, not just for trade, for everything, for data cooperation, for security cooperation, peace and justice, climate change. You know, the UK will have to work with the EU from the outside forever. And, you know, to have approached it in a way which is so insulting and negative towards the EU weakens the UK even more than it's already been weakened by the fact of Brexit itself, the way in which Brexit has been conducted. So, no, but I mean, Boris Johnson, of course, lived in Brussels. You know, he was a so-called reporter in terms of the accuracy of some of the things he said about the EU at the time. But so he understands how the EU works. Of course, he was foreign secretary as well. So anyway, so he understands how the EU works. So I presume that means that he knows where the EU is coming from. The EU has always been very consistent. So I can't believe that he doesn't understand the situation. But, you know, clearly supporting Brexit is a political project for him, which is convenient and delivered him which he wanted, which is to be prime minister.
And I mean, we have been asking everybody that's come on the show about this, but do you think there's going to be a deal? Do you think this is all just smoke and mirrors before Johnson produces something with a flourish and says this is the greatest deal we've ever done, or do you think there is going to be a no deal and that's actually what the UK government is aiming for, as some people have suggested?
Well, I don't think that they have a grand plan. I don't think that he has something in the works that he's going to deliver. I do think they're going to scramble and come up with as many excuses as they can. A lot of blame being placed on the EU, even though the EU, as you said, is very clear about what they're doing. It sounds more like the Scottish government saying, these are the facts. We're going to tell you the hard truths and trust that you'll, you know, be able to make your decision instead of telling people what they want to hear. I do think that Boris Johnson will say it's the best deal that ever could be possible because that's the way he speaks. But what is his motivation behind it? I mean, I don't, like you said, Anthony, I don't think he cares that much because he's still going to be fine.
People, you know, quite happy to see the back of Dominic Cummings, felt he was a really malign influence on politics. But of course, the politicians who gave him a series of jobs and then protected him when he broke quarantine rules and potentially, you know, broke other things during the Vote Leave campaign. Do you think this will actually make any big difference to how this government operates?
No, I don't. And I think, Kenny, that Andrew's quite right when he talks about this being scripted. In my view, it's too scripted. A trick of the Tories over a long period of time is to have a bogeyman of some sorts. And I think that it's suited the Johnson government to paint Cummings as the bad cop for quite some time and to try and get Boris off the book. And they've decided to deploy that particular tool at this point in time to try and resuscitate his image in the polls, Boris Johnson, that is. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a government that's completely incompetent over Brexit. They're taking decisions like putting 20% on the price of PPE and face masks right in the middle of a pandemic. Their public safety messaging has been nothing short of dangerous. And the way that they flip-flopped and delayed on decision-making around the furlough scheme has literally cost tens of thousands of people across Scotland their job. I could go on, things like the internal market bill, the slap in the face that is for devolution. All of these things have added up to a series of bad mistakes recently for that government. So I think they've just decided that this is a good PR tool to signal a change in direction. Whether it will be a real change in direction, I think, is highly doubtful.
Aileen, you mentioned a few minutes ago that you thought the British government reacted to bad press. Well, let's face it, they do get enough of it. You'd think that perhaps that was the case. I'm not absolutely quite convinced. And the most recent bit of bad press to hit, which is just kind of
coming out at the moment is there is a legal challenge against the Prime Minister and Hancock, the Health Secretary, claiming that they have both acted unlawfully in the recent 3 very high-level profiled appointments to public health positions in England. None of these were advertised. These positions, I have to say, are unpaid, but none of them were advertised. There was no selection process. And there's also no evidence that any of them have particular skills that would suggest they were right to be running public health or vaccines or whatever. I mean, being chief executive of a major supermarket doesn't necessarily suggest you're in that position. So the press are dubbing it a chumocracy or a kleptocracy. We know that jobs for the boys and girls is something that has marked this government consistently. In fact, it's something that often marks many governments. What do you make of that recent piece of news to come out, adding to the image that the Westminster government are really haven't a clue how to handle COVID at all?
Well, this is not the only judicial review that they're facing. There are judicial reviews in the pipeline in relation to PPE contracts. Whether they get anywhere, of course, is a different question. Jobs for the boys has been an issue, as you say, in the past. And we had the kind of Nolan principles and standards in public life introduced as a response to that. Yes, a lot of these principles are non-statutory, so that makes that creates challenges for legal action against the government. So I need to, I will look with interest at the basis of the challenges that are being brought here. But I would be slightly sceptical about how far these will get.
Well, it's suggesting that not only have they not followed appropriate standards, but it's also shown a degree of prejudice, because once again, it's preferring a very non-diverse white clique, if you like. And just so people can understand how they all join together. So Baroness Harding is a Tory peer. She's married to a Conservative MP. Kate Bingham, who is head of the UK's vaccine task force, is also married to a Conservative MP. And Mike Coop, sorry, I'm not sure if I pronounced that rightly, who's Director of Testing, NHS Test and Trace, he's the one who's the former Chief Executive of Sainsbury's and was a colleague of Harding's at the supermarket. So that just goes to show how it's kind of all fitting together. Emma, what did you make of it all?
It seems that there has been a lot of pure cronyism. This is like awarding a ferries contract to a company that doesn't have any ferries. And now they're using COVID as an excuse, because they'll say that this is about we need to award contracts, we need to get on with the job, we need to make decisions quickly. But, the whole issue of awarding PPE contracts to companies that don't even make PPE, or putting Kate Bingham in charge of the vaccine rollout and then awarding £650,000 of money for her to have a team to, convey how that's going to work. To me, it stinks of cronyism, and we've seen the interactive maps on Twitter about how everybody's connected and goes back to number 10 in some way. It is just pure, not transparent, and it's not very good.
On to something else that we might not have put money on, is the ghost of federalism has returned, courtesy of Keir Starmer, who has come up again with, this is the plan, this is how we're going to keep the union together, this is how we're going to make sure all the devolved administrations and the regions of England are heard, and there'll be no need for separatism. Now, this is obviously coming in the light of the poll again, saying that the support for independence is growing, the election in May, and the very real chance that there will be an independence supporting majority in Holyrood. And recent figures from Northern Ireland that's showing that the move there for United Ireland is gathering pace again. Like Scotland, so much of that influenced by Brexit and what's going to happen to the border in the north of Ireland. So we know that federalism in the current constitutional setup, where one party is so much bigger than the others, could never work. What do you think the chances are of the Labour Party ever being in a position to push this through in the UK, and the chances of English MPs supporting wider devolution for the regions? Is it something that people talk about in the tea rooms in Westminster, Marion?
Not really. I mean, although I haven't been down in the tea room, it's not really something that the majority of long-serving Tory MPs think about. I mean, whether the Red Wall Tories will make a difference is still to be seen. And, you know, they've got their Northern Research Group, which they're really trying to get what a form of devolution actually on the ground and working. But I think there's so much going on in the hinterland of all this with Brexit, with COVID. I don't actually see it taking off anytime soon. I think it's probably desperation, and because of the realisation, the polls, and that this is real. I mean, if Jacob Rees-Mogg may stand and say what he likes to business questions every Thursday and say the most outrageous things that actually aren't true, but I don't think federalism is actually going to take off. And for it to take off, both major parties in London would have to agree.
And Maree, am I right in thinking it was in John Prescott's time that the idea of English devolution was first mooted? Wasn't there a vote on that?
It's got it goes back further than that, but the only actual referendum was in the northeast of that about 2005, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So which obviously didn't pass. I mean, part of the problem in England is that whereas some of the city mayors, Andy Burnham in Manchester in particular, when there's a high quality politician, a city mayor's job, it's very clear that there's a devolved agenda can start to develop as far as it's permitted by Westminster. But the regions, so-called, of England don't actually represent, in many cases, much regional identity. You know, Cheshire doesn't like being classified in the northwest. Yorkshire is an entity in itself. Nobody's going to go to the barricades for the East Midlands. You know, the thing is, the way in which the women of Derby are not going to demonstrate their solidarity, you know, with those of Lincoln.
No dustbin lids on the pavements of Derby. Is that what you're saying?
But the way these were set up has got nothing to do with English regional identities, or very tangentially to do with English regional identities. But I think the core issue, I mean, please save us. We've been reforming the House of Lords since Lloyd George, and that was 110 years ago, and it hasn't happened. We've been electing Labour governments since 1923, and we haven't seen a change of powers within the UK that wasn't forced from outside as with a constitutional convention. Not suggesting Labour didn't have a big role in that in Scotland, it did. But basically, a Scottish agenda, it was not a British agenda, and Tony Blair would never have done it on his own. But federalism requires entrenched powers at different levels, which cannot be overridden.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that a UK which has just gone down the cul-de-sac of a fantasy of limitless national sovereignty, and as a result has put pressure on the devolution settlement, and is going to put further pressure on it when the internal markets bill comes back to the Commons on Monday. The idea that UK will line up to entrenched powers is a fantasy. We can talk about Devo Max. 6 years ago in the vow, the Scottish Parliament is going to be entrenched by law, which is actually a constitutional impossibility as the Constitution now stands. And a couple of weeks ago, Jacob Rees-Mogg was suggesting abolishing it. I think people understand that the system, the UK system, can never deliver federalism. But moreover, what point is there in delivering federalism in the context of Brexit?
Throughout this discussion, Adam, you've been at pains to point out of the role that the UK used to have to be seen as an arbiter for human rights and international law. But so much has happened in the last 5-10 years in particular with regarding domestic policy. The question has to be now, can we trust the UK government with human rights?
Oh, I think I don't want to say it can't be trusted, but I think that there are several levels. I think on some of the international issues, the UK still has a very strong voice, and I think that we have, for example, very, very good representation, extremely good individuals and capitals in for example, the UN and in New York and in Geneva, really pushing forward a very concrete human rights agenda. There are certain things that really worry me, though. I'm talking about the international level. Reducing the level of international aid that we provide to other countries is not simply about, it's not humanitarian aid, it's also about development. And that means the development of things like the rule of law. It's about conditioning certain aspects of good behaviour, rather than based on necessarily just on trade. And that does give me a great deal of pause for concern. And I think that the other thing is that because we're not united with our European counterparts, we actually have allowed the change of borders in Europe, something that we absolutely held at the end of the Second World War as being inviolable borders, but the Crimea is now occupied, and the UK's voice in these things is becoming diminished, whereas we were a leading voice in the past. I'm happy to see. I work a lot with a Syrian human rights organization, and there's very little voice on that issue. Yes, there is support for the work that they're doing, but we're not seeing there's so much focus on domestic policy, on Brexit, and I think, in one concrete terms, in terms of the human rights issue, the misuse of migrants and refugee populations, something Alison will know about, as a totem, if you like, of the other, of those outside the walls trying to get in. I think that's a very, very frightening development. So,
Adam, you've mentioned international aid, but when international aid is linked to trade, as it so often is, isn't actually human rights then the price that we pay for that? That it's not international aid for the best reasons?
I completely agree. Chris Paton was talking yesterday. I think he was possibly the senior minister you were referring to, and he was talking about the Uyghur genocide, which is an ongoing issue. We have to play. We have to engage with China. It's a huge trading partner. Can't ignore it. But at the same time, we must be able to stand up to China. We cannot simply, because we're locked in this anti-European status that we're currently in, we can't simply drop the bar in terms of the standards that we require of others. And so I do believe that it is a trade-off, and we should very rapidly get back to the notions that are the values that we should be espousing. And this is where I think, going back to your point about independence, that's where I think the fault lines will be. It's Chris Paton talked about it, Boris leading English exceptionalism. He didn't nationalism. He didn't talk about a British sense, and I think that is where the fault lines will become, is on the values that we apply to these core issues of fairness and non-discrimination.
Okay, well, Alison, it's clear then Adam thinks that the British government gets a C+ in its attitude to international human rights. Well, what about domestic human rights? And Adam mentioned refugees and asylum seekers. That's your area of one of your areas of expertise. Just this week, it has been announced that quietly, while we've all been looking somewhere else, the British government have changed their immigration laws as regards asylum seekers and the issue of returning them to third countries. Could you just explain a little bit about that for the viewers, and also how this legislation differs or doesn't from the old Dublin II Convention, which stated asylum seekers should claim asylum in the first safe country that they arrive at?
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, and maybe just to pick up on what Adam was saying, and your first question to him around, how well the UK government are upholding human rights, and I think in a way human rights at the moment are a presenting issue. They're bubbling to the surface, but actually the question is, how well are we respecting the rule of law? And there are many areas in domestic law where we are seeing the UK government being prepared to actively break the law, test it, and see what happens. And the main area where that has been going on for the last few years has been within the UK Home Office, again and again, testing its own limits of the law that it has made around particularly the deportation, yes, of people who have sought asylum in the UK, but also, as we've seen, under Windrush. So again and again, with a particular and excruciatingly vulnerable population who fall outside often of the human rights conventions themselves, and therefore show up the limits of the human rights conventions and how far they reach to protect human life and human dignity. A particular group of people who do not have documentation have been subject to regular and repeated deportation. And when lawyers have done their duty and have acted on behalf of people in that situation as clients, what we've seen recently is a targeting of those lawyers for doing what is their job.
This week we saw another poll, another record high for Scottish independence, 58% once don't knows are taken out of the equation. It's, again, as I said, a record high, tied with a poll that we had a month or two ago. So, Philippa, the First Minister was doing the rounds of European media this week, talking about independence, talking up the principle and talking up the cause generally. What do you think how do you think that's being heard in Europe?
I think there's a lot of sympathy. I mean, I'm the EU spokesperson at Westminster, as well as health, so a busy 2020. And certainly I think that what I see in my German family is that ever since the Brexit referendum, when all areas of Scotland voted to remain, and you had the yellow Scotland and the largely blue Brexit supporting England, there was a sudden recognition that they were two different countries. I think that while, of course, the EU is negotiating with the UK and is focused largely on the challenges of that, they are observing us. They do speak English. They do observe our media, and they have realised how Scotland has been treated throughout all of this Brexit chaos. And therefore, there's certainly a lot of sympathy, and that has been expressed to me by different people that I've met in different sectors within Europe, that there's a lot more understanding and a lot more sympathy for Scotland. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to come over here and campaign for independence. They're not. Nor does it mean that there'll just be a magic wand that goes, okay, boom, you're in Europe. But we've already heard many European and European Parliament politicians recognizing we've been member citizens for over 40 years. We already meet all the EU acquis, all the standards, and therefore what normally takes the time to enter the EU is aligning your democracy, your human rights, and things like your product standards, your industry standards, your market. Those are the key things. And actually, for the vast majority of that, Scotland already meets them. And our resources in land, in water, in renewable energy, in hydrogen are huge, and therefore are things that are attractive to the EU. And I think also having some kind of phoenix out of the flames of Brexit, having a country that is positive about Europe, is something that will be welcomed, but it will take time. And I think we'll see more of that welcoming narrative in the coming year or so.
Anthony, you obviously, as you said, you're studying European politics all the time. Are you hearing the same sorts of things as Philippa?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that there's been a big change in terms of people's attitudes to the idea of Scotland becoming independent because of Brexit, and because of the clarity which has emerged from that, as Philippa said, in terms of Scotland being a pro-European place. You're right that I've written extensively on how Scotland could join the European Union, not least in the EU blueprint. And, you know, I'm very clear to be extremely well qualified to become a member state of the European Union, but there is a process to be followed. And of course, you know, you go through that as any other country would, but it would be faster indeed, because Scotland, you know, is in a very unique position. And I think that, you know, it's important to recognize the challenges that lie ahead. Of course, there are challenges, you know, that we are stuck with this Brexit deal or non-deal in the short term. And then, you know, we will have, you know, damage from that, which we need to try to mitigate as much as we can. And it's a question of how Scotland can try to maintain its links with the EU and EU member states at all levels, not just in terms of trade, but in terms of, you know, academic and cultural exchange. Yes, in terms of business. Yes, in terms of individuals and so on. How Scotland can try to continue to be part of the major debates facing Europe on issues that matter to all of us, not least on climate change, sure. So I think that, you know, that requires us to be clever, to invest in building bilateral relations with different EU member states, and engaging even more in Brussels, and, you know, as much as possible, trying to ensure that the independence debate does not form part of that. They need to be two separate things, as I've said more than once. You know, the independence debate is something for us here, and then obviously how we engage with European Union countries needs to be about the things that matter to them.
Well, as I would love to talk to both of you more about these subjects, but unfortunately we are pretty much out of time now. Those of you who are interested in Anthony's paper on how Scotland could return to the EU can download it, I believe, from the European Merchants website. Is that right, Anthony?
Yes, it is, Kenny. Thanks.
I can recommend it. It is well worth a read. But as I said, that is all we have time for. So thank you very much to Philippa and to Anthony for joining us. And thank you at home for joining us as well. The whole point of making these shows is to help entertain and educate you. So we hope we've done a wee bit of that today. We do have to ask, if you're able to help support Broadcasting Scotland, then please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter. Your £5 a month will make a big, big difference to everything that we can do here at Broadcasting Scotland. As many of you will know, we're running a crowdfunder just now. We are just very, very nearly at 50, sorry, how much? 15,000. No, not 15,000. Yes, 15,000. 15,000, sorry, yes. So we're just approaching 15,000. I'm just being told we've just gone over 15k. So whoever made a donation during the show, thank you very much for that. If you would like to just make a one-off donation, you can do that at broadcastingscotland.scot/donate as well. If you can't support us financially, we absolutely understand. The shows will always be free to view online, but you can still make a big difference for us by following us on our social media on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, on Facebook, on YouTube, on the Amazon Fire Stick. Like us, share us, let people know where we are and what we do. Your word of mouth is by far the best way for us to attract new viewers. So do please help us out with that. And finally, if you'd like to get involved here, we are always looking for volunteers, particularly as we look towards next year's election. We want to be able to cover that from across the country, get to every count, cover everything the way that any other channel would do. So if you're willing and able to get involved in that, you don't need any skills, we can train you. So if you're interested, do please get in touch with us, and we'll probably look at that we'll probably get back to you in the new year, and we'll start looking at how we're going to approach that. But that is absolutely all we have time for today. So thank you once again to Philippa Whitford and to Anthony Salamone. Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7 with the full Scottish. I will be back on Tuesday at the same time. So until then, thanks very much for joining us and have a great day. Goodbye.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.